Coming up next on the Cultural Connections podcast, examining cultural connections through an educational lens. We'll be joined by Pat DiPillo, World Language Department Chair for the town of Falmouth, Massachusetts. This episode is being recorded live on Thursday, September 16th, 2021. This is the Cultural Connections podcast.
And good evening, everybody. My name is Brian Ives, and I am the producer and host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Before I begin today and introduce our guest, I want to remind all of our viewers that we are recording this episode live on Thursday, September 16th, 2021. This episode is being live streamed on three platforms: Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Therefore, if you have a question you'd like to ask our guest this evening, you can comment below on whichever platform you're watching, but keeping in mind that I am monitoring one feed at a time. So if you're on Facebook right now, we'll be monitoring that for the next 15 minutes, followed by Twitter, and then ending with YouTube. Without further ado, our topic this evening is what the title of this podcast of our show is, Cultural Connections, but we're looking at it through an educational landscape, an educational lens. And joining me via Zoom for the podcast is Pat DiPillo. Pat is the Foreign Language Department Chair for the town of Falmouth, Massachusetts. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me, Brian. These days, we refer to ourselves as world language teachers and world language department chairs because the word foreign sends the wrong message, because it means that it's something out there, and we like to think of the global, world as being connected.
Interesting. Good to know. Well, what I do with every episode is I always ask our guests to give a little bit of a brief background about themselves. So can you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself to begin with?
Sure, I can. As Brian mentioned, I'm the World Language Department Chair for the Falmouth Public Schools. And if I roll the clock back, my interest in world languages began in elementary school when I took French on TV with Madame Slack. And I proceeded to go to Girls Latin, where I studied Latin, French, and then at BC, Spanish. And then I picked up some Italian when I traveled and traveled and studied in Rome and in the south of Italy, and also studied in Spain. And I just kept continuing to absorb more and more language and more of its culture by traveling to so many different countries, not only in Europe, but in the islands in South America and Central America, throughout the United States, Hawaii, Canada, and then at some point, I was ready to assume a role as a leader in a department and helping teachers help students to learn, and not only to learn, but to enjoy world languages. I am, aside from MAFLA, which we will talk about later, I guess we call ourselves co-presidents of EMFLA. That's the Eastern Mass. We still have that foreign, the F stands for foreign in our logos, but it's quickly making its exit. So it's Eastern Mass Foreign Language Association, or administrators, I'm sorry, that's what we are. We're all department chairs. And then I would say maybe 8, 9, 10 or so years ago, I was invited to become part of the MAFLA board. And so my learning about a language and everything that has to do with it, I can attribute to that association, because you take on different roles. And, initially you were expected to work at the conference, but you contribute in different ways. And I've held different positions, and each one carries with it new learning about language, not the language itself, necessarily, although it could be, but the different aspects of it. And we in world language are very fortunate that this year, which is 2021, obviously, a new set of world language standards are being rolled out. And previous to that, our only source of curricula resources, materials was from 1999. I don't know how, I'm pretty sure nobody relied on them and used the actual world readiness standards, which is what ours are based on. But to show how contemporary they are, they contain not just the 4 skills, but also elements of social justice, social emotional learning, and cultural proficiency. So that's where, my interest in, because I've traveled so extensively for, long periods of time, and, have come across different colleagues who are also involved in some tangential aspects of, it may be a different discipline, but still applicable. I, have learned to add to my repertoire, and that's where I guess I am today. I know, as you said, we'll get into the conference later, but that is a tremendous learning experience in many ways.
Absolutely. No, definitely. And a very interesting background there. So yes, we're going to get into this conference that you mentioned in a little while, but starting off with just setting the general tone with culture and education, specifically, obviously, to world language, beginning with modern day and education and culture, specifically, obviously, related to world language. How do you believe within society we are doing with connecting education, specifically, obviously, world language and culture today?
Well, as anybody knows, and, I teach or I administer whatever it is that I do. Actually, I had a very, very interesting experience in a classroom yesterday, and I was shocked. A teacher had to go test and stay, which is terminology for she was a close contact to a student or somebody and had to go get a COVID test. And they make you sit it out just like you do when you get the vaccine for 15 minutes. And I had gone in to observe a class, and she had to leave, so I took over. It was a Spanish 1 class, and she had a list of vocabulary, and I, orally went over como te llamas, como está usted, hola, adios, all of the things, and they knew them, and I thought that was terrific, and I told them so. One student, was acting up in the beginning, and he was joking around about being hungry and going to McDonald's, and even vaulted over a chair. And then I used I have a variety of language stories, but I have 2 of my favorite language jokes, which I told. It's a good thing she came back within 15 minutes because I was clean out of jokes. But I always used to tell my classes of students that the what is up joke, and they used to ask for that all the time. And it's my version of the evolution of language, but it takes you from what is up all the way to R2D2. And I said, to the class, learning a language can be fun. So at the end of this class, when the teacher came back, the student said to me, "Thank you for this lesson." I'm like, my goodness, what did I do? I didn't do it. I didn't really, teach them anything new. I think I ignited the, wanting to learn the language, or motivated them or inspired them in some way. So I always, like to say, doesn't matter what your profession is, but learning another language will connect you to people you never thought you could. I mean, 30 years ago in another district, students used to say to me, "Why am I learning a language? I'm never going to that kind. Why am I learning Spanish? I'm never going to Spain." And I thought, And I said, at 15 years old, you don't know where your life is going to take you. And so now that world has shrunk so much, you don't have to go to a different place. It's right in your own backyard. And so we're immersed in diversity of peoples, of languages, of cultures, of all kinds of things. And that naturally leads to equity because we're all created equal, and inclusiveness. So that's my idea about, or that's my understanding of what culture really is. It's a connector. And I know for a fact, having traveled so much, that the minute you use someone else's language in their own backyard, in their country, they appreciate it far more than if Americans typically have had the rep of, well, I want a hamburger and I want it now, and all kinds of other things. It's just like learning a language. When you learn a language, you have to think differently. So when you're somewhere else, you have to act as they do, and they like it when you do. So I just think that that's part and parcel of what learning a language. You can't separate, in my mind, you can't separate the language from the culture or the culture from the language. So that's, in essence, it all boils down to that.
Absolutely. No, it definitely, I can hear with what you're saying on that. Moving along here, then my next question to you then is, we think about today, modern day, and I think a lot of it, especially with younger people, is consumed with social media, which I think plays a huge role in society today. How do you, along the same lines of the last question, how do you believe social media is impacting the way students examine culture through their world language education?
I guess I have to answer from the teacher's perspective. Teachers freely incorporate elements of Twitter, YouTube. I'm not sure. I've seen Instagram. I've seen texts. I've seen, because, for example, in one district, the teacher encouraged students to use Twitter for things that didn't relate to the classroom. In other words, she wanted to hear when they went to the movies, what they saw, and did they enjoy it or not. And because Twitter, I'm not sure it still does have 140 characters, does it or not?
I think it's been boosted a little bit to my
Yeah, that's what I think. But anyway, that's a short, a reasonable amount of language for a student to produce, for example, at the intermediate mid-level. And well, even that's a little bit, not as extensive as it could be, but I know what she's trying to do. She's trying to encourage, it is part of proficiency. It's part of using the language outside of the classroom in a real way that's organic and spontaneous. And not only that, but when you start to joke around, when you start to have, short little repartees with people in a language that you are studying, or it is not your native language, that's when you know that you are internalizing it and absorbing it, if you have the ability to do that. I mean, it may take some years of study, but I really, of course, the internet connects the world. So it makes it so much easier to get authentic resources. We hired in Falmouth, we just hired a brand new French teacher who grew up in France. And I observed a class yesterday, and she began with a beautiful piece of art by Poussin in a French 2 class. And she connected, there was a unit on holidays. She connected it and I won't say scaffolded, but broke it down bit by bit by bit, and got to the holidays, and were they religious or were they national? And then when the period was over, they were just beginning to look at, how to have conversations in a dialogue. But she mentioned Stromae. Now that's a French singer, and I had no idea who that was. I mean, when I studied in Spain and Italy, of course, we went to I won't say the flea markets, but we went to stores. We went to, sometimes the vendors had tables, places, and you tried to buy pop music. And so I certainly don't know what's current in Spain or Italy these days, but she does because she grew up in France. And so that's, you can't get any more of a cultural connection than that, because students are always looking, young people listen to music all the time, and they want to know, oh, what's going on there? What do they listen to? What do they watch? What do they watch on TV? What movies do they go to? So it's just, it's just a natural, progression from the classroom. And that's when you know that you're really encouraging students to learn a language when they start to do that on their own.
Absolutely. No, very, very true. I agree upon on that. And before we go further, I do want to remind our viewers that we are recording this episode live on Thursday, September 16th, 2021. We are talking about cultural connections through an educational lens. Our guest is Pat DiPillo, World Language Department Chair for the town of Falmouth, Massachusetts. We are currently monitoring our YouTube feed. I know we said earlier at the beginning that we were going to be monitoring Twitter next, but due to unforeseen technical difficulties, our Twitter feed does not appear to be live, but we will be uploading this to Twitter following the broadcast. So if you are watching the recorded version on Twitter and you still have questions, feel free to comment them and we'll do our best to get those questions answered for you. But on to my next question here, which is looking back a year ago now, a little more than a year ago, and that is to March 2020, where students saw their daily routines really change in an instant with a global pandemic known as COVID-19. At the time, when we know there was pretty much almost a year's worth of learning online, how has this changed the cultural aspect of learning for students in the classroom when they had to take all that time, and then bringing them back to the classroom? How has all of the adjustment in a cultural aspect changed the way things are taught with world language?
Well, because learning a language is such a spoken skill, and that's what we call it, interpersonal communication. You can imagine how that was short-circuited, I guess is the right word. In a hybrid, you'd have students in class, and then that cohort would flip-flop back and forth. One week they would be, cohort A would be in the building, and the next week they would be home on Zoom. As a matter of fact, one of our presenters has as a title for her workshop, Roomies, Zoomies, and lessons learned from the pandemic. Students on, and then cohort B would be in the building and cohort A would be at home. And then the next week, cohort B would be at home. Students were really reluctant to speak on Zoom. And so sometimes you'd see black screens. You don't know if they're there. You don't know if they're not there. But teachers, if you ask any teacher in any, I won't even say in this country, in the world, what they think of hybrid teaching, they'll all say, no, absolutely not. Well, because the workload for them was intensive. So what we have to do now is pick up the pieces of all of that. And as any teacher knows, you meet students where they are and bring them forward. So luckily, I wrote a grant and received a DESE grant and purchased a lot of proficiency testing that we'll use for as final exams this year. And my teachers know that the goal is to pump up the interpersonal speaking in the classroom. I don't want to put undue pressure on them because the data that we get from the final exams is strictly for analysis and to inform our practice. Although I'm not, I say that on one hand, but on the other hand, I'm sending them to conferences where there's a lot of interpersonal speaking techniques. And so that they will be able to increase their skills and, you know, in their and through their instruction, begin to, you know, maybe double up on, and I don't know how it's going to work. I've just started to go into some classrooms to observe, and I observed a terrific brand new French teacher yesterday. But and I, because I took a Pearl Institute course 3 or 4 days this past summer, I'm using a coaching and feedback model. Usually I would check off on the observation expectation, 90% plus use of target language. And this year, because of that model, I'm going to ask teachers, what would it look like in your classroom? If this is assuming that they are not using 90% because they don't have I think I know why they don't, and I'm gonna ask them to tell me, but I'm pretty confident that they're trying to explain, sophisticated or complex grammar points that students aren't ready to comprehend because they haven't had enough input from all along. And that usually tells the teacher, well, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't be speaking the target language, but yes, they should be. They just should be trying to think of other ways, as this teacher did yesterday, by using a lot of gestures for, right. I don't know if you can see this on the screen, for cooking and for, she did all kinds of things. She could have been a mime. I thought she was terrific. So I'm hoping due to my efforts and due to their efforts that, speaking improves. And when we look at the data next summer, we'll see if it does. And if it doesn't, then we'll go from there. And, it's a never ending endeavor. You never stop, trying to improve and trying to do better and better through all kinds of, both them and myself. So we do have a supportive environment, and that the superintendent is, extremely behind world language and wants a K-12, articulated sequence. So, it helps to be in a supportive environment too, because otherwise you're swimming upstream and, not getting anywhere.
Right. Of course. All right. Well, so for the second part of the podcast this evening, we're going to be talking about the conference that you alluded to at the beginning, that you are planning and that you were putting together. And why don't you first give us a little bit background about this conference? Who's hosting this conference specifically? Is there, and all of those details before we get into a little bit more details in the specifics of the conference?
Well, hosting is MAFLA, or do you mean it's virtual? It's totally virtual. If that's what you mean, yes, it's totally virtual, which is something that is, talk about foreign talk, is really not my forte. The people do things for a reason. I'm a language teacher because in those days, going back to one of the students in the class yesterday I said I was like, I don't know, ancient history or something. They said, well, you're from the Paleozoic age. I'm like, oh. I'm like, well, I know what they meant. I'm like, no, not that far, but just, so I forgot my train of thought. You wanted to know who hosted. So, okay. So technically, I can memorize up a storm. I can repeat what I hear, but technically I can't. If I told you, I have to bring, when I want a language lab schedule, I have to bring it down to the IT people who, come up with it in about, I call it 5 seconds to success. It took me weeks with charts all over the board trying to make with chart paper. I do have a math mind, but it's not that kind. So I think that's an analytic, ability. So it's totally virtual, and MAFLA, which is the Massachusetts Foreign Language Association, and we're working the foreign out of that, is really the sponsor of the whole, the organization is the impetus for the whole, it's a yearly conference, an annual conference that occurs every fall in October, end of October, right before Halloween.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess my next question to you here is, let's talk about the idea of, because I guess every year, as it's clear, is the conference has a different theme. How did you come to choosing the theme you have for this year's conference?
Well, that is due to a published paper with my colleague Jane Ives in the International Leadership Journal called Pathways to Global Leadership. And that was a while back. But, I was scrolling through the yearly conference themes of, it was ACTFL or NECTFL the other day, and I noticed that NECTFL, I think it was NECTFL, in 2016, had intercultural competency as its theme. So, in other words, when the regional and when the national conferences start to call attention to something that, sends a message. Now, I automatically thought, okay, how can I make this a theme? And I tried to play around with a catchy little phrase and came up with creating cross-cultural connections. And it does have a logo. And above my desk in my office in Falmouth is a mobile that a student in French for Honors made of, it's the visual representation of Le Petit Prince. So I love mobiles. And so I went to a designer and I told him what I wanted, and he came up with the logo. It looks like somebody's, well, there's nobody holding on to this. It looks like it is a mobile, but it looks like, reminds me of what a puppeteer would hold. And there's 4 C's instead of, when I look at my mobile, there's the earth and the planets around it and everywhere that, Petit Prince went. But this is just 4 C's, creating cross-cultural connections. So I know that the people in Glastonbury, Connecticut, when I say people, the district, has worked extensively with Manuela Wagner, who's at the University of Connecticut, and has written books on intercultural citizenship and intercultural competencies across the age range. In other words, from K to 12, K to 20. How do you present these things to students? And one of the things that was made such an impression on me was, at one point, I don't know where I was, if it was visiting in one of the schools in I don't think it was. I think probably it was some workshop that one of them gave, and they showed 2 pictures of houses, and one was like adobe like hut with a thatched roof, and students are asked, well, where do you think this is? And then there was a picture of an elaborate mansion with a swimming pool, and somebody who lives in the lap of luxury. And students were asked, well, where do you think that is? Students typically thought that the mansion was someplace in Hollywood, or and that the thatched hut was someplace in Africa. Well, in truth, I believe that I don't want to say where the thatched hut was from, because I don't want to, give false information. But the elegance of the mansion was, and I can't remember what country, but that was from Africa. So that's sort of like dispelling the stereotypes. That's what culture is all about. I mean, I remember when I first started teaching, and we, taught from Spanish books that had pictures of laborers picking bananas, and that, when I think back on it, I think how horrible. I mean, nowadays and I just saw a choice, not a choice board, but a teacher in grade 8 gave this to her class to, they had to get up, move around, ask one another questions. And it was, where did Ioannis Cespedes come from? Who's the what's the nationality of the prominent Colombian singer on The Voice? What are 3 ingredients of tamales? Just all kinds of questions like that, so that students don't no longer get, the negative images of people in these countries that are, they have been, or we were, told the third world, and no longer is that true. And that's a good thing, because you don't want to think of anything in that, in that sense. That's just not right, because you just think of all the prominent actors and actresses and concert, virtuosos and sports figures and everything else that come from all over the world. Not,
Absolutely.
no longer, do you get the image of, some poor person relegated to, doing menial labor in some huge farm someplace, I guess. That's, so all of that comes into the cultural, picture of why you want to focus on this kind of topic, and to create cross-cultural, you want people to understand how another works, lives, thinks, and they in turn, need to understand what it's like to be from America. I won't even say American, because that we are a melange of, different cultures ourselves.
True, very true. And again, I want to remind our viewers before we go further that we are recording this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast live on Thursday, September 16th, 2021. We are talking about cultural connections through an educational lens, and we're joined by Pat DiPillo, World Language Department Chair for the town of Falmouth, Massachusetts. Moving on here to our next question. You have a lot of different presenters that are going to be speaking at this conference. How did you come to terms with choosing the right presenters for this conference?
As I said, I have to go rely on what the people in Glastonbury have done. They have all, as a matter of fact, they contributed, I don't know if it's individually or, well, it's a big district, and it's a K-12 system, language wise. There's a lot of, the department chair is more like not more like, but I think even the title director is, there's levels of people under her. Like, she's the director, then there's department chairs, then there's assistant. There's a whole different structure, because she supervises more than 50 people, I think, which in some senses could be a small high school. So they have contributed chapters to, Manuela. They have a close connection there. Their Latin teachers do wonderful things with a program called Lapis, and they're all, PhDs from UConn, Southern Connecticut. And it just grew from there. I just based my, because I have the books, and I looked and I thought, okay, Dory Conlon Perugini in the elementary level would be good. Mark Pearsall, who teaches Latin there, would be good. And of course, then, I started to think of the national presenters like Leslie Gran, who is so versatile, she can do anything. Thomas Sauer, who is from East German himself. And Meredith White, who's going to talk about roomies, zoomies, and lessons learned from the pandemic. Kara Parker and Megan Smith, who do creative language classroom and develop all the proficiency units that we use. Barbara Barnett from Wellesley Public Schools. So where are you really from? How teacher biases and, paint the picture for learning in the classroom. Karen Saski, who's advocacy chair of NEL, which is the elementary portion. Dory, I mentioned. Katrina Griffin, actual 2017 Teacher of the Year, who teaches German. And Mike Travis, who heads up the curriculum review team in Wellesley and just is a whiz at how to incorporate grammar into your classroom without actually, I tell, I don't have regular classroom students any longer, but I tell the teachers, when's the last time you walked down a street in a foreign country or, in a different land and heard people conjugating a verb? You just don't, do you? I remember telling students, well, what if you do if you're walking down the street in Mexico City or in Rome and somebody asks you a question? And are you going to go in your pocket and say, well, wait a minute, I have to look it up in the dictionary before I answer you? No, that's ridiculous. So I from all my years in language and from my association in MAFLA and having attended so many proficiency academies and core practices and MOPI trainings and all kinds of other things, I come to know who can do what and why. And then we send out, information for other presenters to, people who want to present. So we have 10 2 and 3 hour workshops. And then we have a series of what's called simulives. Those are pre-recorded, but there's a facilitator who monitors the chat feature in case people have questions. Then we have pre-recorded deep dives, which are 60-minute recorded sessions, and pre-recorded bite-sized 15-minute, like if you want to teach, one strategy or one technique. And we put the word out and people have, submit proposals, and they're everything from Le Petit Prince, il est revenu, which means he's returned. There's a lot in Spanish. There's some obviously in social justice and social emotional learning, and a lot in cultural, people who are already, because I'm so familiar with personnel, I know who, is fluent in what particular subject. And so, I didn't necessarily pick them. They submitted proposals and they were accepted. So that's how that's how we put that together.
That's great. And again, I just want to remind our viewers one last time that we are recording this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast live on Thursday, September 16th, 2021. We're recording this episode live on Facebook and YouTube. Normally we're live on Twitter, but due to unforeseen technical difficulties, our live did not make it through to our Twitter account today, but it will still go up on Twitter. If you are watching right now on Facebook or YouTube and have a question for our guest, Pat DiPillo, please feel free to comment. Right now we are looking at Facebook, but I am going back and forth within the next few minutes of both Facebook and YouTube. We're discussing the looking at cultural connections through an educational lens. And as we get into our final few minutes here, my next question to you then is, how does this conference promote diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, because number one, it's a cultural extravaganza. And so as far as world language teachers are concerned, you're preaching to the converted when you talk about anything that, we're seasoned travelers. We like to travel. We like to go abroad. We like to visit different places. We like to sample the food. We like to listen to the music. We like to read the papers. We like to, see different sites. We like to talk to people. We like to live like the natives live. But imparting that to students, it all depends. If you live where I do, which is, in the city of Boston, it is a melting pot of all different, even as far as our mayoral election, Gone are the days when Kevin White and even Tom Menino and Marty Walsh were the two top candidates are Michelle Wu and I can't remember her first name, but Asabi George. That's number one, it's a woman, and number two, they're have different ethnic backgrounds. So students, are grow up in a world that is different when they see, and there's so many different ethnic. I think the city of Chelsea has people who speak 93 different languages. So if you grew up in that, and I went to a cosmopolitan high school. I mean, I went to school with girls at Girls Latin that were from everywhere. So I don't want to say I'm ethnic blind. I don't think that's the appropriate word. In other words, I'm accepting of everybody because that's what I grew up with. But students in the suburbs sometimes don't experience any of that. And when that happens, I remember in one school district that I taught in 30 miles, I think northwest from here, we had to have a cultural day. Now, why would you need to have a cultural day if you were imbued in the different cultures to begin with? I don't think that exists anymore in this community. I mean, I know it has changed a lot, but in those days, that's the way things were. And so if you are still a member of a community that doesn't have a, large population of other, then you have to bring that message to people and actually bring them out and have, actually the best answer to this is to have extensive immersion program. That's not exchange programs where students actually experience a different culture by living in. I know the town of Weston, I believe sends their juniors or seniors abroad for a year, which that's a pretty long time for a high school. And maybe it might not be seniors because that's a critical year. Maybe it's juniors, but even that's a critical year. I mean, you apply to all your colleges and things like that. So, there's lots of social justice, also has elements of diversity and equity and inclusiveness in it. So does social emotional learning and its gender equities and all, never mind the cultural proficiency, understanding another's way of life and thinking. So it's just all of those things. It's, when you walk in a classroom, those students experience a person. And if you're not, and I'm not saying teachers do this or even have done it, but the message emanates from you. So if you approach these things in a positive light and, have a classroom there's a lot of ways to build community. And that's what we're trying to do at the beginning of this year because we were so much apart. And that's and that in itself is a microcosm of, inclusiveness. We have to bring all of that back together. It's not easy. I attended an admin meeting today where I learned just what the health office is doing in terms of test and stay and how many students and what the procedures are. And I thought it's kind of scary, even to the point where principal had to remind the administrators, get that mask above your nose because we're a model for students. And God forbid you don't want to put yourself in harm's way. So for all of those reasons, I think students are happy to be back in the building. And I think they're more open to, learn. Look at the student said to me yesterday. I was like, well, you're welcome, but wow, I was shocked. I was only there for 15 minutes. Imagine if I were there all period or all year. Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. And hard to believe, just like that, we're reaching the end of our podcast today. I want to thank Pat DiPillo again for joining us today on the podcast. And I want to remind all of our viewers that if you had a question that you would like answered that you did not get answered during the podcast today, please feel free to reach out to me directly and we'll forward on your questions to make sure they get answered. You can reach me by email at brianives@gmail.com. That's BRIANIVES@gmail.com. So, and also use that same email address if you have questions or comments about this episode or want to submit ideas for future episodes of the podcast. We hope you enjoy this podcast and learn something new today. For now, I'm Brian Ives, and I'm the producer and host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Stay tuned for further episodes of the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Brian. It was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast. For more information on today's episode, be sure to check out our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also watch this episode again in its entirety on our YouTube channel. This podcast is also available on listening platforms Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Breaker, Radio Public, and New TV. Thanks again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast.